Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is on a three-nation tour covering Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, he's looking to bolster ties with Indo-Pacific nations as questions swirl over America's commitment to the region and amid China's growing influence.
Yeah, Mr. Modi visits Australia today after concluding his trip to Indonesia, where he signed a missile deal and other agreements spanning defense, trade, and technology. Chani Vavani has more on the elevated strategic partnership between the two nations.
16 strategic partnership agreements and Indonesia's highest civilian honor for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The two nations also signed deals on Tuesday, including the sale of BrahMos missiles manufactured by an India-Russia joint venture. The agreements are among the latest efforts to deepen ties between the two countries.
आज के युग में टेक्नोलॉजी की सप्लाई चेन रेजिलियंस बहुत मायने रखती है। क्रिटिकल मिनरल्स और स्टील के क्षेत्र में सप्लाई चेन को अधिक मजबूती देने के लिए भी अहम समझौता हुआ है।
After their bilateral meeting at the presidential palace, the two leaders witnessed the signing of agreements covering space, defense, critical minerals, agriculture, health, telecommunications, research, and cultural heritage preservation. Indonesia also finalized a long-discussed BrahMos missile defense deal. An Indian government official said India will supply the BrahMos cruise missile system and the Astra air-to-air missile, while Indonesia's Republic Corp signed an air-to-air missile agreement with India-based Bharat Dynamics. The leaders also reaffirmed their commitment to counter-terrorism, combating transnational crime, expanding digital infrastructure, and boosting connectivity.
Saya menyampaikan dukungan terhadap pembangunan pelabuhan di Kepulauan Andaman dan Nicobar di India dan juga pengembangan dan pembangunan pelabuhan Sabang di Aceh sebagai penghubung strategis antara Pulau Sabang dan Kepulauan Andaman dan Nicobar di India.
After meeting President Prabowo, Prime Minister Modi visited and addressed the Indonesian parliament before meeting members of the Indian diaspora. On Wednesday, he is scheduled to visit Prambanan Temple in Yogyakarta, where he could announce the start of an Indian-backed restoration project before departing for Australia and New Zealand. Chandni Vatwani, CNA, Jakarta.
For more insight on the Indian Prime Minister's tour of the region, let's speak now with Pradeep Taneja, a senior lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Taneja. So what does this three-nation tour tell us about how India sees its role in the Indo-Pacific at a time of growing geopolitical competition?
Well, yeah, I mean, this visit is really an indication of India's growing interest in the Indo-Pacific, particularly India's Act East policy, which Prime Minister Modi renamed. It used to be called Look East. Prime Minister Modi, when he came to power in 2014, he renamed it Act East. And we've seen over the last 12 years, Indian government really intensify efforts to engage with countries of the region. And that includes Indonesia. This is Prime Minister Modi's third visit to Indonesia. When he arrives in Melbourne this evening, this will also be his third visit to Australia, which is very rare because no Indian Prime Minister has visited Australia 3 times. And then he goes on to New Zealand, and this will be the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to New Zealand in 4 decades. So clearly, there's a lot of emphasis on the security in the Indo-Pacific, but also economic cooperation with the countries in the region.
Doctor, just following up on the Act East policy that you talked about. So, this three-nation tour really seen as an important step there in advancing the policy. It's been more than a decade as well since this policy was launched. How would you assess its success?
I think it's been fairly successful, as was clear from the welcome Prime Minister Modi received in Jakarta over the last couple of days. President Prabowo, went and personally received him at the airport and he was accompanied by 4 ministers of his cabinet, and then he was invited to address the Indonesian parliament. So overall, if we look at the welcome that Prime Minister Modi has received, but also the kind of agreements which have been signed during this visit. Your background report referred to the export of Indian missiles, BrahMos missiles, which are a joint venture between Russia and India. And this would have been unprecedented a decade ago. And now we are seeing India supplying cruise missiles to the Philippines. There is a similar sort of understanding with Vietnam, and now to Indonesia. And I think all of this indicates a closer sort of understanding on the security situation in the Indo-Pacific. Both Indonesia and India are worried about developments in the region. China's growing military power, China's increasing assertiveness in the region, I think is bringing these countries together. And that includes Indonesia and Australia.
You touched on defense, but I wonder where else do you see India's biggest opportunities in the Indo-Pacific? And also, what are the biggest constraints that could limit New Delhi's ambitions?
In terms of other opportunities apart from security cooperation, clearly India is one of the world's fastest growing major economies, if not the fastest growing major economy. And as India's economy continues to grow in these very challenging times for many other economies, I think this would create better conditions for economic cooperation, for trade and investment between India and the other Indo-Pacific countries. For example, we've seen trade between Australia and India increase to over $50 billion a year, and that trade is expected to exceed $100 billion in a few years' time. So clearly there are economic opportunities, but in terms of constraints, clearly India's economy is, in terms of the gap with China, China's economy is today 5 times bigger than India's economy. And therefore, there would be economic constraints in terms of how India engages with the Indo-Pacific region and Southeast Asia more particularly. So there is clearly a limit to how far India can go in terms of providing economic assistance to particularly poorer countries in the region. And clearly there is a degree of contest between China and India when it comes to providing development assistance or other assistance to countries in the Indo-Pacific. And I mean particularly developing countries in the Indo-Pacific. Both China and India see themselves as champions of the global South. And there are plenty of countries that see themselves as part of the global South in the Indo-Pacific. But economic constraint is going to be, I think, the most significant constraint. Plus, India has its own developmental needs, and India needs to focus much more on developing its own economy, developing its own capabilities. So I think that would be a constraint on India.
Yeah, just on that note, I mean, very quickly, what gains do you think PM Modi can expect domestically from this diplomatic tour?
This diplomatic tour obviously is designed to strengthen India's regional and global position. But clearly, when politicians travel overseas, there is always one eye, at least, to the domestic, constituency. And Prime Minister Modi still is quite popular in India. He's won 3 elections in a row. And he is engaging with the Indian diaspora, for example, both in Indonesia, and he will be doing that tomorrow in Melbourne. And in Melbourne, 30,000 people, largely members of the Indian diaspora in Australia, are likely to attend this major event where Prime Minister Modi will deliver a speech in a stadium. And that would certainly be telecast live on Indian television networks. And in the eyes of Prime Minister Modi's supporters in India, this is seen as not only an indication of India's growing stature, but also Prime Minister Modi's own personal popularity.
All right, many thanks for joining us. Pradeep Taneja, Senior Lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne.